everybody. Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic, and hopefully you'll find something in it that relates to you. I think that the only thing that's interesting that I have to share is there's something typical about me that I think a lot of other people relate to, and so that's the kind of way I want to start off. But I'll start off by saying I've been a public interest designer for 30 years, but only knew what to call myself for the last 10 years. So it's been a journey. So I'm going to take you a little bit through that journey and tell you how we got to the idea of seed and the purpose behind seed. So quick background, I had a pretty typical education, sort of on a very straight architecture career track, Princeton undergrad, Yale grad, got the job I wanted with Stephen Hall in New York. And but after about 6 months there, I said, if this is architecture, I don't want to be an architect. And so I kind of had a midlife crisis pretty quickly. And I just felt that the work we were doing in that office was not really meaningful to anybody besides the people in the office and a couple of people besides that. I mean, we were doing well, but winning awards, and there were a couple of things that kind of resonated with me and made me feel it wasn't significant. We were doing a project in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's called Edge of the City. It was funded by the Grand Foundation. It was going into the Museum of Modern Art. But nobody in the office had ever been to Phoenix, and it never occurred to any of us to talk to somebody in Phoenix. And I started to suspect that this actually wasn't going to be meaningful to anybody in Phoenix. And turns out, I can tell you at this point, 30 years later, that it wasn't meaningful to anybody in Phoenix. So I just felt like if I was going to dedicate myself to something, I wanted it to be meaningful to somebody else and not just padding my own resume. So one lucky thing, though, was I had this summer job while I was in grad school, and this was in 1986, and I met a guy named Samuel Mockbee, and he was practicing in Jackson, Mississippi. And if you know the story of Samuel Mockbee, he started the Rural Studio in 1993, so this was 7 years before that. But he said, how would you like to come work for us and design these 3 houses for low-income families? And I thought that sounded great. So I had this opportunity of working with Sam Mockbee on 3 houses. What had happened was the local newspaper had approached him and said, would you design houses for 3 families, and then we'll apply for a grant. So we went out with a United Way worker and a Catholic sister and met some families. And the lesson I learned from Sambo that I didn't learn from Stephen Hall was there is poetry in people. And if you listen to them and respect them, no matter what kind of challenges they may face in life, as architects, we have the opportunity of celebrating them and expressing their lives. And so this was one of the families we met, the Luckett family, 3 children. Mr. Luckett was a pulpwood hauler, which is kind of like collecting tin cans in a city. This is, you collect pulpwood and take it to the paper mill in the country. And this was one of his trucks. He had 2 trucks, and neither one of them had a hood, but he'd take parts off one and fix the other one. And I'd say their income was about $6,000 a year, but a really strong family, very loving family, very proud of the children and their certificates of achievement from school, even though they had holes in the roof and they had no sewer and water in this house. But even in day-to-day existence I kind of felt was heroic. And this is Mrs. Luckett. Even though there's no water in the house, she's kind of going through this traditional ritual of a family and washing the dishes, and there's just a bucket catching the water under there. But they could move into Jackson, Mississippi and live in HUD housing, but their tradition and their roots were so strong in the country that they didn't want to do that. So it made me realize the sacrifices that some families were willing to make for their values. So this was the house we did for them. Traditional in some ways, except that there's a bay for Mr. Luckett's truck to park in, and they sat outside a lot. And so we made the sort of living room space, a porch, and then upstairs there was, well, there's his car. And so what happened was we applied for this grant and we didn't get it. And then we proceeded to win a Progressive Architecture Award. And I think for both of us, it was a real challenge. Like, why do architects see something valuable here? And this foundation that was less competitive than a PA award was didn't see a value. And I don't know why we didn't get funded. I kind of suspect now we didn't explain this as a sort of shift in paradigm to how we could respectfully house people even if they were low income. This housing was much cheaper than the rental housing units per unit in Jackson. So it was affordable and respectful. So it was a real lesson to me, certainly a lesson different than Stephen Hall's office, where I really felt we didn't respect the people we were designing for. So that was kind of my introduction to this possibility. So when I left Stephen Hall's office, I kind of had this concept that this could be done. How could we design for people who really needed it, not just for sort of museums or resume padding? And so I moved to central Pennsylvania because my sister was working with legal services in central Pennsylvania with migrant farm workers, and she was inspecting housing. So I had the opportunity, well, I didn't really have much opportunity. There was no architect there. There was nobody to get a job with. But I took the attitude, I don't know anything about farm workers, and I have to learn from scratch what they might need and how to be a designer for them. So this was so what I did was I started volunteering for legal services and going to inspect housing for code violations. So this is some of the housing I inspected. Outhouses actually meet code for farm worker housing, so they have a sort of level of code below what we would accept as standard. So I kept trying to find a way to bring design into the need. So I kept calling up, the only thing I could think of to do was call up the Adams County Housing Authority, and they wouldn't talk to me. And finally I talked to the director and he said, we already got an architect, and hung up on me. And I was just trying to volunteer to learn about affordable housing. And so finally I talked to him. He said, oh, you don't want to work for us. You want to work for Rural Opportunities. They're doing migrant housing. So I went to Rural Opportunities, and here's a lesson I learned about this type of work. The people who really need design don't even know what architects are, and they're not going to call you because they don't know what we do. So we have to be proactive about it and go find how we can be of value to them. So it's our job. It's our job to demonstrate our value. So what I did, I proposed to Rural Opportunities. I said, well, look, you know about migrant workers and I don't. You're a 501c3 and I'm not, but I have some design education. How about if we work together on a grant? You tell me about the need and I'll design something, and we'll go after a National Endowment for the Arts grant. And you know what they said? I mean, they said, what the hell? You know, I mean, I wasn't really asking for much. I was asking for their time and knowledge, but they said, sure. So we did that, and I won't go through all the research, but basically we came up with this unit and we applied to the National Endowment for the Arts, and we got a grant of $40,000 to pursue this project. So then they came to me and said, we've got a job, a housing developer job. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to be called a housing developer. That's kind of rough. But how about this? I'll do your job description, which didn't contain design, and I'll do design in overtime, unpaid overtime. And after 2 years, if it seems like design is of value to the job, then we'll change we'll add that to the 9 to 5 part of the job, and we'll change the title to housing designer. Well, the first thing they asked me to do was to go out and see how many housing units we could put on a piece of property. So I was doing design from day one. They just didn't originally understand what design had to do with their mission as a nonprofit. So I went to work for them for 2 years, and we built housing, and it worked out really well. And so after 2 years, we changed my job title, and I was designing in 9 to 5. And I stayed there for 5 years and learned a lot about the nonprofit world and housing delivery. I won't go into all the features of this house, but just one, for example, we realized by looking at where farm workers were living is a lot of them would go in and one person would go into the bathroom and lock the door, and everybody else would go into the kitchen to start making dinner, and they didn't have a chance of washing the pesticides off before they were in the kitchen. So in this design, you see the screen door there, and there's a sink immediately there for people to wash off, leave their equipment there, try and keep the pesticides out of the rest of the house, and clean up before dinner. So that's an example of some of the things we did for them. The worst housing was also these huge rooms with bunk beds they called them bullpens. Farm workers called them bullpens, very inhumane way of living. So we decided to break the housing down into these smaller units. So basically a social unit could arrive in a car, and that same social unit could move into the housing. Anyway, after 5 years, I started, you find a strange niche like design of migrant housing, and there are not too many other designers doing that. So I kind of became recognized, and eventually started getting work in other states. I got a call so at that point, I started my own nonprofit, which was essentially just the same as Rural Opportunities, except I put design in the mission of our nonprofit. And the original mission was designed for the 98% without architects, which I'll talk about in a sec. But in any case, the point is that I started getting other jobs. This was some housing in Florida that got hit by a hurricane. Legal Services paid us to come down and do a design unit. This is the housing that wasn't even hurt by a hurricane, so you can see how bad it is. So we designed this unit, and it resists 130-mile-an-hour wind. It has air conditioning. But I basically say to farmers, I am not your architect. You're not paying me to be your architect. You can't design the unit, and I want to talk to your workers about what they need. And we got federal funding to pay for half of the construction cost. So it was a good deal for the farmer. And we also said, we're going to put a lien against your property for that amount so that you need to do what we want you to do. You can't charge any more than this amount of rent. You can't put up no trespassing signs. You can't put more than 6 people in here, 5 people in this one. So it really became a win-win. The workers loved it. The farmer was happy. Legal Services loved it. So that got me to this idea. And when I was in Pennsylvania, I read this article that said only 2% of new home buyers work with architects. And that kind of struck me that 2% represented the work that Stephen Hall and basically all practicing architects was in that narrow percent of the population. And there was 98% of the population that really wasn't working with designers or even valuing designers. So that's when I started the mission Design for the 98%. Nicely, the Cooper Hewitt, 3 years later, came up with a show Designed for the 90%. They gave me a nice credit for the idea. I'm glad we were making some progress. Now we're down to 90, I guess. But anyway, so at this point, I'd just been kind of working alone, and then I started realizing there were other people in the country doing this work, and we weren't really exchanging ideas. So what I'm going to talk to you now about is the research that Dasha has talked to you about, the Latrobe Prize, but also a lot of other documents prior to that that sort of showed that it could be done. And, before I got started at Rural Opportunities, Sambo had started the Rural Studio, and that really inspired me. I saw that really good design could serve people that really needed it. And that was the story of that house is amazing. How Ms. Bryant had diabetes and had a double amputation while they were building the house, and she never could have gone back into her other house in a wheelchair. So just incredibly meaningful, done by Auburn students. But so this is one of the things that I think has changed now is that these aren't hypothetical proposals. These aren't singular architects' visions. These are very proactive practices, people going out being very creative about how they do this work. And so this has continued, I mean, since the start of the Rural Studio, lots of evidence. So I realized that people still consider this a pro bono activity. And so the work that Dasha talked about was when we received a Latrobe Prize and started interviewing other architects about how do you get paid for this. And I've been trying to explain to people what we were doing, not just me, but all of this sort of collective action was happening. It was kind of really informal. We didn't really share much ideas, but it really was a profession. So we came up with this name and it really suggests a profession. And so before I get into measurement and aspirations and ethics of a profession, I want to just say to you, I think it's really important for us to consider this work as a profession. And so I'll read this definition. So it's sort of, this name kind of popped up in 2011. Public interest design is a practice of design with the goal that every person should be able to live in a socially, economically, environmentally healthy community. Similar to public health, this field looks at all issues that impact the whole of society. Like public interest law, this field seeks to provide services to all of the general public, not just the individuals who can pay a fee for service. So when I started out by saying that I'm typical, I really feel like I'm part of this growing, emerging profession. And it doesn't really matter what you call it, but I think it's something taking shape rapidly. And I'm sure many of you are involved in it too. So I like to talk about, this is one of Dasha's schoolmates, but I kind of see this project as a poster child of public interest design. And I'm sure many of you know of this project, but the story I'm going to tell about it, you probably don't know. And I happen to know Michael Murphy, who was the founder of Mass Design when he was starting the project and was still a student at Harvard. And so the story that he told me at Harvard, when he was a first year, he went down to the School of Public Health and he heard a lecture by an architect named Paul Farmer. And Paul Farmer, a doctor named Paul Farmer, and Paul Farmer had started a NGO called Partners in Health, and they were building hospitals all over the world. And currently they were building hospitals in Rwanda, replacing military bases with hospitals. And that was important because the country had just gone through a genocide and 1 million people had been killed, and the military had been a part of that war. So to replace the military bases with hospitals was literally healing the country. But Michael went up to Paul Farmer after the lecture and said, "I'd like to work for your architect." And Paul Farmer, you may guess, said, "Why do I need an architect? I designed the last hospital on a napkin." So the point of this story is that Paul Farmer is a fellow at Harvard College, an amazing guy, visionary leader, but Paul Farmer is part of the 98% because the 98% is people who don't understand the value of design. It doesn't mean you're low income, it means you don't value design. So that's Paul Farmer said, "Why do I need an architect?" And so Michael said, "Well, if I can help you, let me know." So, and gave him his number. So a month later, Michael got a call and Paul Farmer said, "I'm building a hospital in an area in Rwanda, and it's a hospital for 400,000 people. Would you be interested?" So that's kind of intimidating. And I don't know how Michael got into Harvard because at that point, all he had done is like painted his father's house. So he hadn't even like designed and built a house, but all he realized was he had to do better than a doctor's napkin sketch. So Michael bravely said yes. But then what Michael did that was very smart, he went down to Rwanda and he looked at the hospitals that Paul Farmer was designing. And he realized, this was pre-COVID, we have a lot of lessons learned now, but he realized that people were coming to those hospitals with communicable diseases and spreading them in the waiting rooms, in the hallways. So he went to Paul Farmer and said, look, your design is directly having a negative impact on your mission. And so Paul Farmer sort of realized that architecture wasn't just about aesthetics or whatever preconceptions he may have had as to why he didn't need one. But then Michael also said, how are you hiring your contractors? Because he went to this area and he realized people needed work. They didn't just need healthcare, they needed jobs. And he said, how do you hire your contractors? And Paul Farmer said, we do it on bid solely. And what that meant was that the lowest bidders were a multinational Chinese corporation that would come in with Chinese workers and build the hospitals and then go home. And that was great for the Chinese workers, but it did nothing for the local community. So Michael said, well, let's hire a local community. So they hired 1,000 people to build this hospital. They used local materials. This is a local volcanic rock, and they came up with a way of carving it. So they trained masons to use local material, very little mortar involved. Put as many of the public spaces outside, or at least with fresh air. Did some sensitive things that architects do, like, it's a beautiful view. Instead of having the patients staring at each other and the doctors in the center, they put the patients in the center. And so instead of looking at each other, they're looking outside the beautiful scenery. So the moral of this story is that Paul Farmer became a believer in design and started hiring Michael for all his projects. And so this is an example of a seed project. So what seed means is it's a triple bottom line, and I'm sure Dasha told you, the social, economic, environmental design. And the way we came up with that name was a conversation of a small group of people were meeting, and the challenge on the table was, how can architects do a better job serving communities? And in 2005, LEED was sort of, in its heyday. And somebody said, we need something like LEED, but that is also considered social and economic issues like SEED. So we kind of came up with a counterpoint acronym, SEED, which is not just the environment. And going back to the idea of approaching migrant workers with a humble attitude, that you don't know anything. This is an attitude where you go to a community and you say, what are your issues and what are your challenges? What is your vision of success? And maybe there's a role for design to play here, maybe not, but maybe there is. And if there is, I'd like to propose that. And so that's the basic idea of SEED, is this bottom-up decision-making process where communities are their own experts about both the challenges they face, but also in the solutions. So this is what we call a SEED scorecard. And, this is the kind of thing that communicates really well with non-designers, to have this sort of measurement. And politicians love this because, they can get up and give a speech, and that's a great thing. We love politicians to get up and talk about our buildings and how valuable they are. And what's happened with this hospital is it became a prototype, and they're building these hospitals all over Rwanda, hiring other architects like Jeannie Gang, and actually building a institute to train doctors, and actually started the first architecture school in the country. But so some of the social metrics, 140 beds, 1,000 Rwandans employed, provided job training during construction, food, water, and healthcare provided to all employed, community design process employed, including daily site visits with doctors, experts, local builders, air exchange rate of approximately 12 air exchanges per hour. Economic, first regional hospital in Utaro district, local laborers and materials used for construction, environmental, local volcanic rock, and a local wood used, 6 culturally significant trees preserved, which was important culturally, rainwater collection, 100% renewable water from hydroelectric, and located on main thoroughfare. So, you know, I think the lesson of this is that we need to show communities that we did what we said we were going to do. Building a building and walking away is not enough. What actually happens in our buildings? What is the change that results? So we've got to get over this idea that we're done when we hand over the certificate of occupancy. That's really just the beginning of the change. And like Michael, if you're a part of that, if you're associated with the change that happens afterwards, you get a lot of credit. And now Michael, Mass now has 200 people. I think it's about 12 years old, Dasha, probably. 12 years old, they have 200 people, 100 people in the US, 100 people in Rwanda, in their office there, and winning all kinds of awards, doing amazing projects like the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. Time magazine called it one of the best projects of the decade. So their empathetic, participatory, respectful process, I would say, isn't just for the 98%. This is really a better design process for 100%. You know, if you think about sort of the quote that made me leave Stephen Hall's office was when he said to a magazine, "I agreed to do this house because the client promised not to interfere in the design." You know, that wasn't like something he said in the office, that's something he said to a reporter. So if you think about a doctor, if a doctor took that attitude, he came in and he said, "I don't care what's wrong with you, I feel like taking your appendix out." Well, pretty soon, 98% of the public wouldn't be going to doctors anymore. So I think it's really, it really is a paradigm shift about how do we practice, how do we respect our clients, who do we define as clients, and how do we show them that we did what we said we were going to do, not make promises and take our picture on the ribbon cutting day and walk away. So I know Dasha introduced this to you, and Dasha was a great, great part of this work. It was great to have somebody brilliant to help me out. And thank you, Dasha. But we got this, this research prize. I got it with 3 others. Did you tell who the others were, Dasha? Okay, so Sergio Palaroni, Roberta Feldman, and David Perks and I received this opportunity to research the profession. And the results we put together in this book, but it's sort of saying this is happening. This isn't sort of a theory. This isn't sort of a dream. This is really happening. And so there are a lot of case studies in here. And one of the things that I value about this book is there are case studies indexed under issues. And I think that's the other thing about SEED is that we have to say, why is the 98% ever going to care about architecture? They will care when it addresses the critical issues in their lives. So if we can demonstrate that architecture can assist in crime prevention, or architecture can assist in employment, or in reducing communicable diseases, this is very convincing for the public to, to understand what we are doing for them, this is not some abstract concept of architecture that they don't understand. And furthermore, we've gone ahead and looked at how is this being taught in schools? How is it being taught well? Because I never had one word of this discussion when I was in architecture school. So that's unfortunate, you know, for people to have to learn on our own. So let me stop now and ask if there are any questions. That's sort of an introduction to building this field and an introduction to seed. I wanted to ask if there are any questions. Oh, there's some in chat. Let's see. Oh, thank you.
Not a question, but more of a comment. I'm thrilled to see that you're considering kind of the post-occupancy piece as an essential part of design. That's something that we've talked a lot about in our practice as well. I'm wondering if there's sort of like a pre-design corollary to that are considerations you think that architects should be making kind of before concept even starts. That's sort of that inverse of the post-occupancy evaluation.
Thank you, Kate. That's a great question. Absolutely. One of the things I've learned is what you should want to measure in post-occupancy is change. What is the outcome that you created? Well, if you're measuring change, you need a before and after. So I've had some deep regrets where I've had some projects that I thought were very successful, but we did no measurement beforehand. So I can't really say, well, here's the results. I mean, the results are results. You can't really show any improvement or not. So one of the things about the seed process is to ask certain questions early on, including how will you measure, what is the change you hope to see, and how will you measure it? And so not only does that prompt you to take a before snapshot, but it also helps you think about what you're going to measure. And some things are really unreasonable for us, especially in an architecture office, to measure. So I think to think about what we can measure, I'll give you an example. This is an industrial design example, but there's a firm, an industrial design nonprofit called Design Matters. And they were given a job of reducing particulates on charcoal stoves in India, because people use charcoal stoves inside and the particulates cause cancer. So very smart of them, they decided to measure the reduction of particulates rather than the reduction of cancer. And reduction of particulates was something they could measure easily in their, in their own capacity and in their own facilities. They never would have had the capacity to measure a reduction in cancer. They left it to other research to show the relationship between particulates and cancer, but their post-use, and we use the term post-use in seed because we try not to be discipline specific. But anyway, their post-use analysis showed a reduction in particulates, and that was something they could measure. So one of my favorite projects was after Katrina in New Orleans, and they were trying to bring back some economic, this wonderful street called Ferret Street had been highly vacant, but businesses were coming back. But the problem after Katrina was you didn't know if the business was inside or not. So they asked us to do something on the street to show that something was happening. We did a bus shelter, and if I go to that street, or even a year after that, it was 100% occupied. But I didn't measure how the unoccupancy beforehand. So I have no ability to say what the change was. So one important thing, a concept. So seed has developed. We're working on the 5th iteration now, and I would just let me give you all a sort of. You've already heard me talk about writing grants. Well, a nice thing about seed is it is based on the logic model, which is a grant. So the seed process is actually identical to writing a grant. So people who don't know how to write a grant, I shouldn't tell you that, because if you look at the seed process, you think it's a design process, and that's great. But then it's also asking the same questions that any foundation is going to ask you. And the benefit of that is that well, it's tapping into the foundation resources. But as we've developed seed, the Kellogg logic model, you can look it up. There's a 75-page guide on it. It's very valuable to read, but there's a lot of jargon in there. So our first seed 1.0 had all this jargon, and I still have trouble understanding it. But the point of what I'm saying is that there's 2 words of jargon we have left from that original dictionary of logic model jargon, and those are output and outcomes. And I want to explain the difference to you because it's really important for architects to understand this. An output is an object, something, well, it's a building, for example. It is a thing. An outcome is a change, right? So architects are very happy with outputs. I mean, designers in general, we're happy with a design, or we're happy with a product or a thing. What we need to think of is not the output, but what change does the output make? What is the outcome? So understanding the difference and holding ourselves more accountable for outcomes than outputs. Sorry to hit you with some jargon, but I think that distinction is really important for designers to understand. But that gets back to the idea of measuring or knowing what you're going to measure. And so let me just give another case study. This is a beautiful project in New Orleans. This was also after Katrina. The city park in New Orleans was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, and it had 2 public golf courses. Well, after Katrina, the city said, well, maybe we don't need 2 public golf courses. What can we do more valuable? And they realized there was a food desert crisis going on, of lack of healthy foods. There was also a lack of living wage jobs for young people. So they challenged Tulane to come up with an idea and use some of this beautiful park for that project. So what Tulane proposed was this youth farm that addressed these 3 challenges. So what are the challenges? That is one of the critical seed questions. What are the challenges faced by this community? So a lack of opportunities for youth employment, empowerment, and development. Poor nutrition, which corresponds to high rates of obesity and health. Lack of access to fresh produce in a city that has a low ratio of grocery stores. Now let me ask you all something. If I went to the general public and I said, hey, do you think that that youth unemployment, obesity and health, and food deserts are design issues? I would bet most people would say, no, those aren't design issues. So that's our failing, right? I believe every issue is a design issue, and we need to have that attitude to sort of take these things on. Now, not by ourselves. It's not only a design issue, and you'll see how it's a collaborative process. And I think that's part of the public aspect of public interest design, that it's not just a transaction, it is a holistic approach to a solution. So
Bryan,
those were the challenges. Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for just one moment. That's such an amazing point. I do also want to just note that it is 6:30, and so I know that originally we were scheduled to go until now. We were lucky to have Bryan speaking to us and presenting this, but I do want to recognize that we were a bit late starting. So if anyone who's interested, we can keep going for another 15 minutes or so, if you'd be okay with that, Bryan, and if everyone else would be interested. But we also, understand. I just wanted to check in with everyone on that timing.
Yes, and again, my apologies. Chats are coming in.
Sorry. Yeah. So please keep going.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move fast through this, but the result is they teamed up with a local nonprofit called GrowDat. They built this. they built this wonderful training institution and addressed those three issues. So one of the wonderful things about SEED is to learn all the issues out there that design can address, and to have proof of concept, and they measure results about employment, about food produced with this project. Let's see. One of the learning objectives was to talk about the collaborative process, but I think I'm going to kind of skip ahead to so let me just skip ahead to talk more directly about SEED. So I think the only way that we're going to have an impact on the 98% is if we do think about a profession. I mean, public health is not very old. I mean, medicine is much older, but public health does a lot of things that medicine can't do. And so this is a picture of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And the point of this is that public health made a lot of really stupid mistakes early on before they really just established their ethics. And this was a case where they let rural sharecroppers die, even though they had a cure for syphilis. Terrible. This is the U.S. Public Health Department too. You know, there are cases of this in journalism, even before fake news crisis hit us, but people making up captions for photographs that nobody said. So there's an ethics to journalism. And so these ethics are very important for the public to trust these professions. And so thinking about public interest design as a public service that needs the trust, or nobody will hire us or work with us or value us, we need to think about what are the aspirations, what are we saying to the public that we will do for them? And they're just some dumb things that we do. I won't go into details, but this was a show at the Museum of Modern Art. They claimed to be about foreclosure and had nothing to do with foreclosure. It was just sort of silly game. And you know, when they interviewed the mayor of Orange about this proposal, he said, "I don't know anything about this project," which shows that it wasn't a good public interest design project. The mayor doesn't know anything about it, even though it's in the Museum of Modern Art, you know, similar to Stephen Hall's work. The public never was involved. And then some things can get kind of dangerous, like when we propose things that supposedly are tsunami solutions. And this is a proposal on the Open Architecture Network where you're supposed to climb into this cube and the tsunami wave hits you. And I don't know if there's water and air in here, and obviously you wash around and maybe roll over. Is there a bathroom in here? I don't know. So this is just, it gets a little bit dangerous. Fortunately, nobody ever used this thing, but it was presented to the public as a solution. And it was actually presented on NPR as a solution. So SEED kind of started with the idea of what are our aspirations. And so this group sort of became a network, and through sort of doodle polling and survey monkeys, we came up with this mission and these 5 principles. I'm not going to go into them, but I just want to say that a profession means to profess a mission. So it's not the same as a trade, which has great value, but we need to think about, we're not very good in architecture about communicating what our public mission is. Like law has justice for all. That's a pretty compelling, understandable aspiration. So these aren't the only ones. I would just submit to you, these are some to think about for yourselves. You may have others. You may not agree with any of these. But the point is that we need to profess a mission and start communicating that with the public. So as Dash has explained, it's a network, it's an evaluation tool, and it can be a certification. So going back to Kate's question, how are goals defined and accomplished? Did appropriate project planning cause the intended effect? So those are really the goal, the reason why we evaluate. It's also a marketing tool. I mean, Michael Murphy makes a lot of, good pitches by demonstrating the impacts and the measurements of his projects. So here are the 4 distilled benefits of this. What we've done is, after looking at all these good projects, we said, what is being done in common? And so we define that as a step-by-step process. And so it kind of it suggests to people what a best practice is. We require participation by people who would be impacted by the project. So if you're designing farm worker housing, how are farm workers involved in this? You can't just claim to be doing something. Participation is critical. Transparency, just like public health. What is your process? What are you promising? What happens if it doesn't work? So there's a transparency important in a public profession. And accountability. And this is where the measurement comes in. You have a proof of concept. How do we measure success? How can we go back and show that evidence? And that's where this measurement becomes a critical part of this establishment of trust to the public. So, not going to read these slides, but basically, you walk through the process. Here's the website. You submit a project. You can download the instructions. So the process has 3 steps to it. And going back to Kate's point, we have some things we want to know first, then we review it and either send it back to you or pass it to the second phase, which gets more into design specifics and program specifics and who's participated. And then the third is post-use, and that's when it's certified. And we say, did it have the results that were intended? So I'm not so you see the steps on the right-hand sidebar. But what you see in the yellow box is when we send it back to you, we send it back with comments, either seed criteria or suggestions or opinions. So we're very careful about identifying the difference between those 3. We also use this for our seed awards. We recognize exemplary projects, and we also use this in our publications. So now here's one of the things that I get excited about is this growing list of what are design issues. And we get very excited when somebody comes up with a new one under other, So if we don't have evidence for something like restorative justice, we get very excited about that. See a new issue come in. So here's where we ask, what are the critical issues you're addressing? And what is your research method? How are you going to measure it? So this, again, is part 1. This is sort of that first step that Kate asked about. And then we ask, so those are the different other issues: education, environmental sustainability, 3 issues. Then we ask for the preliminary design documentation. So that's part 1. And part 2 is sort of an iteration of those, go into more detail as things change. What are the issues? What's the design? What are the research methods? What are the participation methods? And how are you going to measure results? And then part 3 is actually pretty simple. It can be pretty intimidating to think about post-occupancy. But we have measured results. And then we have measures of success. We have community perspectives. So we also want the qualitative stories, not just the measurements, but human interest. How did this impact people? And then also your own analysis and what worked and what didn't work, your sort of reflection. And then we share these and they become case studies. So then other people learn by your successes. And so here's a project that now demonstrates local building techniques, primary school, improving quality of building stock, on-the-job training. So if you're looking for examples of on-the-job training, here's a good case study for you. These are other measurements: accessibility to healthcare, So then they become case studies, and then we share them as examples of how to measure success. So I think that kind of wraps it up for, kind of was quick, but this is just, I'll just end on this because this is a performing arts center in Durham, and you think, oh, a big deal. That's just going to provide, high-end entertainment for wealthy people. But actually, the way they approached this was as a seed project, looking at what jobs it would create. Was actually meant to bring, again, a lot of vacancies in downtown Durham. So the idea was a lantern in downtown Durham, and that's the party. It's literally a lantern. It was built on a brownfield, so that was restorative of a downtown environmental issue. And then all the economic success associated with this project. So instead of just becoming like a high-end entertainment, this became a very public building. To the degree, one of the indicators I think about this is they could sell the naming rights for a lot of money, but Durham is so proud of it and so many people participated in this process that they like it to be called the Durham Performing Arts Center. They refused to sell the naming rights for about $1 million. So that kind of shows the sense of ownership and equity. I kind of equate equity with being involved in the design process, having ownership of your built environment. And so getting back to 98%, if the 98% is involved in design, that is giving them equity and giving them empowerment and letting them address the critical issues in their life. And design can be a tool for that. So I think I'll end there. I'm happy to take questions.
Bryan, that was amazing. I wish we didn't have to go so fast, and I think this is a great opportunity for people to ask questions that might bring Bryan back to some of those really intriguing slides that he kind of had to breeze over as he was getting here. So I do just want to add that what I really love about this tool is that it's so flexible and that it allows people to set their own goals and identify how they're going to accomplish them, and then it measures success based on that rather than based on some rigid set of constraints that are prescribed by an organization. And so I just wanted to add that I think that's a really special kind of way of evaluating projects, and having these kind of examples to learn from is also really incredible. So yeah, thank you so much for presenting, and I want to leave space for other people's questions. Anyone can you can chat your questions, or you can just unmute yourself and speak.
It costs $100 per phase, so $300 total, which is another way that it's not like LEED. And so we subsidize that cost because we don't want to financially eliminate people that we most want to serve by charging them $700,000 or whatever it costs to do a LEED building these days. So, so that's just a FYI. It doesn't cost anything to join the SEED network. So if you'd like to hear about we publish case studies, we offer training and let people know about awards. And because, frankly, I'd say my job is trying to be a PR firm for great public interest design projects, because showing them to the public is how this is going to happen. So if you want a free PR person, submit your, not just me, but we're actually working with the whole Design for Common Good. It's a global network now. SEED is one of many networks. We call it the network of networks. So we're going to scale. So now we're doing this collaboratively. And when we do awards, we do it with other networks. And one way is to sort of do a Venn diagram. What are our aspirations, and how do they compare with live projects or PAC-RIM or Design Build Exchange or Curry Stone Foundation? So it really should be global, and it really should really I like to think that at some point we'll look back at this period of 2% and just think, what a small part of architecture what we're doing at this point. And the thing I like to say to the AIA, and I say, you guys are all competing for that little tiny slice of the pie. I'm out here serving this 98% and I don't have any competition. So, you know, if I can get paid for that, then it's a pretty good business model. And I really do hope that this becomes a paid profession. And the thesis behind it really is, when we demonstrate that design has a social value, society will pay us for it. And that's, my God, what would we do without public health? But, you know, about 100 years ago, nobody would have conceived of who was going to pay anybody to solve cholera in Haiti. And that's, you know, beyond the scope of any medical professional alone. Just beyond the
Bryan,
scope of any.
I had a
single
question
life.
for you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Moni. I wanted to commend you for taking on this mantle and educating us. Some of us have been practicing for many years and haven't had this lens or have tried to, but haven't been successful. There are some students on the call and some academia folks, so I wanted to ask also a little bit, because you had to skip over some of that. What has been the work you're doing in academia? I was trained as an architect, but I'm currently working at Stanford University. So I'm curious to see if the education component that you were talking about is being implemented, and what's the receptivity of teaching this in school?
So the receptivity is driven by students, and but probably even at Stanford, you compete for good students. And you know, I think they realize that it can be done, which I didn't. I was told you can't do this at Yale. They said you can't do good design and serve the public. I was told that by Giuseppe Zampanini. Anyway, so I think when they realize they can do their best design, in fact, even the concept that you couldn't do your best design and serve the public, they don't even understand what I'm talking about. My students, I mean, they don't have that baggage that we have. Or thank God. And so I think people like Mass are demonstrating that that's not a distinction. So students are desirous of this. Can I show you one really? So I run what's called a public interest design incubator studio. And I've learned from Tulane. Tulane uses this well. And Tulane issues a request for collaboration. And so instead of waiting for nonprofits to call you, they say to nonprofits, you call us, and then they get a very competitive application pool to do a project every year. So, and they do a paper project that they consider funding ready to give to that nonprofit. So I take it a little bit further, and I call it an incubator studio. And so we are collaborating with right now we're collaborating with a local architecture firm. They've sponsored our studio. They pay for our travel and our hotel. And we go out to rural North Carolina and we look at access to rural health and the problems of, you know, community hospitals that are closing, and rural people who don't trust hospitals and don't get screened until they need an emergency vehicle. So we're going through a brainstorming process. And so we put our results together in a publication. I don't know why it's blurry, but here we go. So this is a publication of about 20 students' ideas. And I tell the students, you have to get your idea verified by a stakeholder. Go out there and find somebody who's going to say that's a good idea. So we're going to the Atkinson Volunteer Fire Department barbecue next week, and we're volunteering to hand out barbecue, but at the same time, they've let us interview people that are sitting in cars waiting for the barbecue, and they're raising money for the fire department. So one of the ideas that's risen to the top. When we have reviews, we invite stakeholders from Pender County, and they kind of say that's a really good idea. One of the things we realized was there's a trust issue. We asked, how come people from this part of the county, the poor rural part, didn't answer your health assessment? They said they don't trust us. They wouldn't even talk to us. So they don't get treatment until they need an ambulance. So we said, okay, trust is an issue. And then somebody said, well, you know who they trust? They trust the local fire department because they know Joe. And so we said, all right, well, let's do these mini. So the proposal is to have a mini clinic attached to the fire department, and the firemen. So we don't need to add staff. The firemen can go open up if the cancer screening is coming that day, or so let me show you this. So we're hypothesizing this about fire departments. So one of my favorite stories is one of my students were trying to talk to some firefighters, and they called him and they hung up on him. And so they went to the fire station anyway. And the guy said, oh, that was you that called us? You called during our favorite TV show. So that's how, so, and then they talked to him for a long time. Anyway, so this is what happened to us last week. So I went to this fire station. Let me see if I can find this. Be real quick, but it's quite amazing. We went to this fire station and the doors were open. So I walked in and handed him one of these booklets. And oh boy. Let's see. All right, sorry. Well, I'll just tell the story. You don't need visuals. So he said, well, look at this. So he pulled out a whiteboard of the fire chief's drawing of their new building. So it wasn't exactly Paul Farmer's napkin sketch, but it was kind of close. I mean, it was a fire chief's drawing, and I wish I could show it to you. But they're planning on building a new building. And I said, well, we can help with that. And so this was last week. So I've been talking to them daily about how we can come and talk to people. And they said, come to the barbecue. And it's just been amazing. I call it throwing spaghetti at the wall. These students have a million ideas, and some of them are really good. And the process is, how can you quickly iterate? And that's one of the things I didn't show, was that the iteration idea that we do so well. And why we're magic, our superpower is that a design idea is an asset. And we can just produce those so we bring assets to a community that they don't have. And we can have 100 assets in 10 minutes. This is a thing we do. And so putting ideas out there. Now we proposed to the fire station, well, do you want just a fire station, or would you really like to have like a weight room where the community could come and get in shape also? So we're trying to kind of expand. It's not just for them. How can it be for a lot of the community? And then guess what? When this is Hurricane Central, so how do we convert this to hurricane recovery instead of having it? FEMA works out of a tire store in Pender County because it's one of the few places that doesn't flood. Well, how much foresight is that to be working out of a tire store? We get a hurricane every 3 years. So anyway, so that's kind of our process. And I tell the students, I say, if you find a stakeholder and they tell you it's not a good idea, that is super valuable. And redirection is just as valuable as verification, because guess what? If you didn't know that, you'd build a freaking building and nobody would use it, and you would waste a lot of time, and you would actually hurt the reputation of architects by building our own visions that don't do anything for anybody, like that Arizona Stephen Hall project. But that didn't get built. But the point is that they need to have this ability to have a conversation with non-designers. I never talked to a single person in reality in school. So guess what? My design process is designing for these fictitious people in my head. Well, guess what Stephen Hall does? He designs for fictitious people in his head. And if there's a real person sitting there, he's like, will you please shut up? You're interfering in my fictitious person in my head. That's the process I learned too. I always had a fictitious person. And that's what was wonderful about learning from Sambo was that, no, you want to find the poetry, you listen, and you know, some of the stories they were telling me about hurricane recovery is incredibly heroic stories of almost being washed away, and how they say, we're not approved for shelters, but we're all we got. So we got to shelter families, you know, and it's just, they actually have to have food helicoptered in because they're totally, all the roads are flooded. Anyway.
Bryan, we have another question here.
So I don't know if that helps, but just to give people, well, they also understand how valuable they are. I mean, I guess that's the thing.
Thank you.
For them, for this fire chief now to be like, they talked to us for like 3 hours. They don't want to let us go. I mean, it's pretty convincing that we just found them and they really need design.
Yeah,
I think
brilliant.
reality proves
Yeah.
the point. Okay, sorry.
That's amazing. Another question. Letitia is asking, how might this work to better drive better design outcomes for affordable housing in ultra expensive markets like San Francisco? How do you convince real estate developers to engage in public interest design? And you know, we're experiencing, we have a housing crisis. It's so expensive to live here, and it's hard to motivate people to engage and work for the public good when it's so much easier to build things that they're able to be well compensated for, or better compensated for than they perceive they might be.
Yeah.
I think that's an amazing
That's a
question.
good question. I mean, it's hard to interrupt an efficient ecosystem. And, you know, high-end housing, market-based housing is a pretty efficient ecosystem. And the ways of disrupting. So a good public interest design project is a win-win-win-win-win. And so the more wins, the more people are happy with it, and the more value that a single object has, right? So I'm always looking for the multiple win, but if you've got a sort of a transaction between buyer and seller, and you know the architect has some sort of paid role in that, they're not really able to impact decisions. It's hard to kind of my suggestion, my approach is more to go out and find ecosystems that aren't so efficient and impenetrable. Or, you know, I mean, it's easy to say to a developer, I mean, I don't know if you still have Bridge Housing, but Bridge Housing used to build affordable housing in San Francisco, and their single ticket was to get extra floors from the city approved. And so their model became effective. So that brought in the city as a stakeholder, and it wasn't asking them for cash. That became effective because it started, the more people you bring in, the more opportunities you have these solutions happen. So I guess so I would say traditional architecture is a transaction, right? So I go to architect Dasha, I say I want a house, I pay you, you design a house. That's like traditional medicine. I break my arm, I go to Dr. Dasha, I pay you, you fix my arm. So those are transactions that are, you know, one-to-one. But but public health doesn't work like that, and public interest design doesn't work like that. You need multiple players to be able to craft a more holistic solution. So I guess I would say there's some cases, unless you want to disrupt, like, or bring in a zoning variance, or say you're requesting a zoning variance, you want people to show up to support you at a public hearing. Trust me, you have stakeholders that you've been working with for a year. You fill that room full of people that that planning board knows, and they're saying they want that project, you get the zoning variance. I mean, that's where this is the most enjoyable, when the support turns out and says, we want this project. I'll just say, I'll tell another example. It's not exactly related to that, but one of the most amazing public design projects is, can I tell a story, Dutch, or do we need to go to another?
Yeah, I think maybe this story, and then if there's one more question after
Okay.
that, and then we'll try to wrap up.
Okay. So let's take Atlanta. All right. So Atlanta's not San Francisco, but it's a, expensive real estate market. So this student, Bryan Bell, did a thesis project where he identified there's a problem with public transportation in Atlanta. It just makes a T. It's very inefficient. So Bryan found all this abandoned railway lines and made a belt line for his thesis project. He graduated, he went to work in a firm, he told his friends about it, and they said, you ought to send that into the city council. So he sent it in to all the city council people. One city councilor opened up his letter. She had just come back from her meeting with her constituents who were complaining about public transportation. So she called up Bryan, said, I want to do this. So they are doing the Atlanta Beltline, Bryan Gravel's thesis project. It's a multi-billion-dollar project, but Ryan worked for a long time before to make it a public project. And the point of this story was, he was standing in back of a church and he was waiting to speak, and he heard these women in front of him. This was way before it started getting built. It was still just an idea. And he heard them refer to it as our Beltline. And he said that was just an amazing moment for him, that it wasn't his thesis project anymore. It was their project. So that, disrupted a lot of expensive real estate and for the good of the public. And Ryan went to work, so it became this huge project, and went into Perkins, not Perkins, I forget what firm it went into, but then Ryan had a great job, but then he quit because he wanted to be an advocate for the people and make sure that it was benefiting the people that could be impacted by it. So I don't know what that has to do with affordable housing and ultra expensive markets, but I do think it can work in urban environments that need something, and I guess the last thing I'll say is tell my students, don't just be creative when you sit down to lay out windows. Be creative about how you approach your profession and what you can do. I mean, how can you go out there and talk to people about design? That takes real creativity, and so that's what we're good at. We're creative people, and I think things like Bryan Gravel project just show kind of solutions that have not been imagined.
That's such a great moral to the story. Does anyone have one more question? Otherwise, I think that was such a beautiful kind of, I don't know, it was such a beautiful packaging of everything that all of the key things of our value as designers and the value we can provide, and the true care and the true inspiration we draw from having provided that value to people who can really benefit from it.
Well, I thank you for having me. And again, I apologize so much for being late. You all are wonderful to say anything nice about me after I was so late, but I know Dasha was probably a better speaker than I was anyway. So
I only spoke very briefly and not at all.
Dasha did a great pinch hit. Well, I have to say, as an architect who now specializes in affordable housing, I'm feeling very puffed up by your presentation. It's pretty amazing work that we do. So if any of the students, particularly on the call, but really anyone on the call, wants to find out more about what that looks and feels like in Silicon Valley and the South Bay, I'm happy to answer questions offline. Lots of people know how to get in touch with me, but thank you, Bryan. This is a fascinating conversation.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining. Thank you, Brian. Have a great night. I
Best
know it's
wishes,
late over there.
everybody.
Thank
Have a
you
great
very
evening,
much.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.